My name is Claudia. I'm 33 years old, and for the better part of 6 years I showed up every morning to a beige-walled office on the 4th floor of Riverside Regional Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia, where I coded patient records, reconciled billing discrepancies, and managed the kind of paperwork most people don't think about until they get an insurance denial letter at 2 in the morning. The job had a title, Health Information Technician, but at family gatherings, my uncle always found a simpler way to describe it. Claudia's still doing the filing. He'd ask my mother, loud enough for the entire living room to hear, before turning to whoever happened to be standing nearby and adding, "Smart girl. Could have been a nurse, could have been a physician's assistant. Instead she alphabetizes charts for a living." Then he'd laugh. That particular laugh he reserved for things he found genuinely funny, and the room would follow along. His name is Sterling. He built his first physical therapy clinic in 2009 with a small business loan and whatever he'd managed to save, and by the time I was working at Riverside Regional, he had 3 locations spread across the Richmond metro area, a staff of more than 40, and a reputation in the family as the kind of man who made things happen. He wasn't wrong about being successful. He just used it as a measuring stick for everyone else. My father rarely said anything when it happened. My mother would sometimes offer a quiet, "She does a lot more than that, Sterling," but the moment passed too quickly for it to land. My cousin Camden, Sterling's oldest son, who managed day-to-day operations at the clinics, usually just looked at his phone. I stopped explaining myself about 2 years in. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when you realized the people listening aren't actually listening. They're waiting for you to confirm what they've already decided. What I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, was that I'd been studying for my Registered Health Information Administrator certification every evening after my shift ended. The RHIA isn't a participation trophy. It takes years of experience, a bachelor's degree, and a national credentialing exam that a significant number of candidates don't pass on the first attempt. I passed mine on a Tuesday in March, sitting alone in a testing center off Midlothian Turnpike, and I drove home in the quiet and ordered a pizza and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. About 6 months before the exam, a colleague at the hospital, a careful, measured woman named Hazel, who had worked in compliance for nearly 2 decades, mentioned that Virginia's Medicare Audit program occasionally contracted certified health information professionals for external record reviews. The work was part-time, sensitive, and required someone who could read the space between a billing claim and an actual patient record, and know exactly which questions to ask. Hazel had done it for years. She thought I'd be good at it. She was right, though I didn't fully understand that yet. I applied quietly, completed the onboarding training, and took on my first assignment the following spring. A small orthopedic practice, straightforward. The second was a home health agency with confusing documentation patterns. The third arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. I opened the referral email and read the clinic name, then I read it again. Sterling Rehabilitation and Wellness, 3 locations, Richmond metro area. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything else. The referral had come through the standard CMS pipeline. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services had flagged a billing pattern across all 3 clinic locations. Physical therapy claims showed a statistically elevated rate of high-complexity treatment codes in cases where the documented records described routine maintenance-level visits. Billing errors happen constantly in outpatient therapy settings. But the pattern was consistent enough, and across enough quarters, that it warranted a formal external review. I thought about calling the review coordinator and asking to be reassigned. I sat with that option for the better part of an hour. Then I thought about what Hazel had told me during onboarding. The entire reason external reviewers exist is to remove personal bias from the process. Pulling myself off the case because of a family connection would just introduce a different kind of bias. I would have to be very, very careful instead. I didn't tell anyone. The following week, the review team received its document packages. My co-reviewer was a man named Leon, a former hospital compliance officer with 15 years of field experience, methodical and impossible to rattle. We received hundreds of pages, patient files, billing claims, treatment notes, progress documentation, physician referral records. I started reading. The records told a complicated story. Sterling's clinics weren't cutting corners on patient care. That much was clear from the documentation. Patients were being seen, therapists were showing up, treatments were happening, The problem was in the translation between what occurred in the therapy room and what appeared on the billing claim. Medicare physical therapy billing uses CPT codes, procedure codes tied to specific treatment types and durations. A high-complexity therapeutic exercise code requires niche showing medical necessity, measurable functional goals, and the kind of clinical judgment that goes beyond basic maintenance. A significant portion of the claims I was reviewing billed those codes for sessions whose own progress notes described exercises a patient could have performed at home after a few weeks of guided instruction. It wasn't invented treatment, it was overstated treatment consistently across 3 locations over 3 years. When Leon and I finished the preliminary record analysis, the identified overpayment totaled somewhere between $900,000 and $1.1 million in improper Medicare reimbursements. The clinics had received that money. Medicare needed to understand why. I sat in my apartment that Friday night with printed pages spread across my kitchen table, something I never allowed myself to do with work materials, and I thought about my uncle. I thought about the staff, 40-some people whose paychecks depended on those clinics staying operational. I thought about the patients, people coming in twice a week with bad knees and rotator cuff injuries, trusting that the care they were receiving was being documented honestly. I thought about the last family dinner, 2 months earlier, when my uncle had introduced me to a new neighbor by saying, "This is my niece Claudia, works at a hospital, administrative support." The neighbor had nodded politely and moved on to the next conversation. I put the papers back in the folder. I went to bed. The first indication my uncle had that something was happening came through my mother, not through me. Camden mentioned at church one Sunday that the clinics were going through a Medicare audit. My mother called me that afternoon and asked if I knew anything about how those processes worked. I said that major reviews involved multiple agencies, external contractors, and a formal documentation request process. I said they typically took several months. I said the outcome depended entirely on what the records showed. My mother was quiet. "Are you involved?" "I can't discuss active reviews," I told her. "You know that." She didn't push, but before she hung up she said, "Just be fair, baby. Whatever it is, be fair." She meant it as comfort. It settled on me more like a responsibility. Camden texted me a few days later. We'd never been close. He was 5 years older, already managing operations at the clinics when I was still finishing undergrad. But his message was friendly in the way people become friendly when they need something. He asked if we could catch up, said he'd been thinking we didn't talk enough. I wrote back that I was buried in work, but hoped things were going well. He tried again 3 days later, more directly this time. "Hey, I know you're in health information. Is there anything you can tell me about what auditors are looking for in therapy billing records? Just in general terms." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed, "I can't give guidance on anything related to an active review. I'd strongly recommend working with a qualified healthcare attorney and a billing compliance specialist." He didn't text after that. The hardest part of the process wasn't finding the problems in the records. It was the management presentation. Standard protocol for external CMS reviews includes an on-site verification visit where clinic leadership can walk the review team through their billing practices, explain their documentation processes, and provide any context before the preliminary findings are drafted. Sterling didn't know I would be in that room. The meeting was scheduled at the main clinic location on a Thursday morning in December. Leon and I arrived at 8:45. Patients were already in the waiting area. A therapist was walking someone through exercises near the front window. Sterling arrived at 9:10, came in through the back with 2 staff members and the compliance consultant the clinics had hired to help prepare. He walked into the conference room, shook Leon's hand, and turned to look at me. I watched his face carefully in that moment, not looking for guilt or embarrassment. I was watching to see whether he understood what was actually happening. He did. For a few seconds he didn't speak. Then quietly, "Claudia." "Good morning," I said, and I kept it neutral, and I think I managed it. The next 2 hours were the most professionally exact I have ever sat through. Leon led the review team's portion. I handled the documentation questions. When the billing consultant tried to characterize the high-complexity code pattern as standard industry practice, I walked through 4 specific claim examples line by line and explained exactly where CMS documentation requirements diverged from what the record showed. I was not harsh about it. I was accurate. I worked very hard to stay on the right side of that difference. Sterling asked very few questions throughout the presentation. Near the end, when the consultant was finishing their prepared materials, my uncle looked directly at me and asked one thing. Is there a path forward that keeps the clinics open? I told him that wasn't a determination I could make, that the preliminary findings would go to the review coordinator, then to the CMS regional office, which would issue a formal findings letter outlining options, a repayment agreement, a corporate integrity agreement, a corrective action plan, or something more serious. I told him the outcome would depend significantly on whether the pattern reflected systemic billing decisions or documentation failures, and that the distinction between those two things mattered enormously in how the regional office would respond. He nodded once. He looked older than I'd remembered from Christmas. Leon and I spent the next 3 days finalizing the preliminary report. At one point he looked up from his laptop and said, "You're doing fine. I've worked reviews where the analyst knew the subject personally. It happens. The job doesn't change." He wasn't trying to reassure me. He was just stating a fact, which was exactly what I needed someone to do. The preliminary findings confirmed the overpayment pattern across all 3 locations, just under $1 million over the audit period. The report noted that documentation practices, rather than deliberate fraud, appeared to be the primary driver, but that the consistency and scope of the pattern exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to isolated coding mistakes. The clinic's Medicare provider status would be subject to an immediate compliance review, pending the formal findings determination. I signed the report on a Thursday afternoon and submitted it. Driving home that evening, I passed one of the clinic locations on West Broad Street. The parking lot was still half full. Through the front window I could see the reception area, a therapist guiding a patient carefully toward the back hallway. People who showed up every morning to a job that had nothing to do with any billing code. People who didn't know that 7 months of paperwork had just been handed over to a federal office to determine what happened next. I thought about what it actually means to be fair. Not fair to the person you know, not fair to the institution, fair to the people who have no other advocate and no seat at any table where decisions like this get made. I had been fair. I knew it in the specific documentable way the job required me to know it. But knowing something and feeling settled about it are 2 different states, and that distance took a while to close. The formal findings letter reached the clinic 6 weeks later. I wasn't part of that stage. My role ended with the preliminary report. What I learned afterward came in pieces, the way family news always does. My mother told me first. Sterling had accepted a structured repayment agreement with CMS covering the full identified overpayment, spread across 24 months. The clinics also signed a 2-year corporate integrity agreement, quarterly billing audits by an independent organization, mandatory documentation training for all clinical staff, and regular reporting directly to the CMS regional office. Provider status remained active. The clinics stayed open. All 40-some people kept their jobs. Camden called me 2 weeks after the letter, not to be angry and not to perform gratitude. He said it had taken him a while to separate what was happening from who was doing it. He said he was glad it had been someone who understood what the stakes were. That was more than I'd expected. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just told him I appreciated him saying so. My uncle didn't call. Not that week, not the week after. My parents came to Richmond for Christmas. Sterling's family hosted the gathering the way they always had, and I went because not going would have made it about something it didn't need to be. My uncle moved through the evening differently than I'd ever seen him. Not cold, just careful, as if he were managing a version of himself he was still getting used to. Toward the end of the night, after dinner was cleared and most of the family had drifted to the living room, he found me in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then, the compliance consultant we hired told us from the beginning that our documentation practices were a liability. I didn't want to hear it. He paused. I kept thinking that as long as revenue was strong, we were doing things right. I didn't fill the silence, I just let him finish. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not just for the audit, for a lot of things before it." He didn't elaborate, he didn't enumerate or build a case. He said it and then he stood there, and for once he didn't need to fill the space with anything louder. "I know," I said. We stood in the kitchen a few more minutes before the noise from the other room pulled us both back. It was the quietest conversation we'd ever had. It was the most honest one, too. The following spring, The independent auditing organization overseeing the corporate integrity agreement contacted Riverside Regional looking for a health information professional with outpatient therapy billing experience and an active RHIA credential. Hazel forwarded me the inquiry. I thought about it for several days. Then I accepted, with the condition that my role would be advisory rather than findings level, given the prior connection. They agreed. Over the following year, I worked with the clinic's billing team to rebuild their documentation protocols from scratch. Not because anyone required it of me, but because I was good at it. And because the 40 people whose jobs were on the line were less abstract to me than they might have been to a reviewer who had never sat across a holiday table from the man who signed their paychecks. The clinics passed their next 2 quarterly audits without a single flagged claim. At the final quarterly review before the corporate integrity agreement expired, Camden found me in the parking lot as I was loading my bag into the car. He said that Sterling had told the new billing manager that his niece was the reason the clinics hadn't lost their Medicare status. Not in those exact words, Camden said, but close enough that it landed. I hadn't known that. I drove home that afternoon and sat with it for a while. I thought about all the years of family dinners where my job was the setup for a passing joke. I thought about how long I'd been certain that the people around me had made permanent decisions about who I was and what I was capable of, and whether anything I did would shift them. The answer wasn't as clean as I'd once imagined it would be. There was no single moment where everything reversed. No public correction that balanced the scales. Just a slow, quiet shift in the way certain people talked about me. Mostly in rooms where they didn't think I could hear them. My uncle never stood in front of anyone and announced that he'd been wrong. That's not who he is, and somewhere along the way I stopped needing it to be. What he did was tell his billing manager, in a conference room in March on a Tuesday, with no one watching who mattered to him, that his niece understood healthcare compliance better than anyone he'd brought in. He said it without an audience. He said it without expecting it to get back to me. A younger version of myself would have needed the public version. Would have needed the moment where he said it out loud, in a room full of people who'd heard the jokes. The version of me who'd spent 6 years in a beige-walled office, studying after long shifts, sitting alone in a testing center on random Tuesdays, that version understood something different. The work had never actually been about being seen. It had been about being ready. About being the kind of person who, when something genuinely important was on the line, could be trusted to do the job the right way. I'm still at Riverside Regional. My title changed 2 years ago to Senior Health Information Manager. I oversee a team now, spend more time on process and training than on individual chart reviews. I still take external contract assignments when they come through, though less frequently. Hazel retired last fall. At her going-away lunch, she told the table that she'd recommended me for the compliance program because she'd once watched me catch a billing discrepancy in a report in 14 sects, something a room full of experienced people had missed. She'd never told me she was watching. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled and made sure she got the first slice of cake. There's a photograph on my desk from a family gathering 2 summers ago. My uncle is in it, standing next to my father near the backyard fence, both of them looking at something off to the left. I'm at the edge of the frame, turned away from the camera, talking to my mother. Neither of us is performing anything for anyone. We're just there, in the same yard, in the same family, the way we have always been. It's not a dramatic photograph, that's exactly why I kept it. The work I do isn't what my uncle would have pointed to when he pictured an ambitious life. It still doesn't come with a name on a clinic door, or a coat with a title embroidered on the pocket. What it comes with is the specific, unambiguous knowledge that when something real was on the line, when the outcome mattered past the personal, past the family history, past 6 years of being the punchline of a joke told at my own expense, I did the job the way it was supposed to be done. Some mornings, driving into work, I pass one of the clinic locations on West Broad Street. The lot fills up early. Through the front window, I can see the reception desk, the chairs where patients wait, the hallway where therapists walk people carefully through their recovery one session at a time. I built a career out of the thing everyone at the table decided wasn't worth taking seriously. And the day it mattered most, that career was the only thing standing between my uncle's life's work and the kind of ending that none of us would have come back from the same way. That's the part I never needed him to say out loud. I already knew it, and eventually quietly in his own time and in his own words, so did he. If this story brought someone to mind, someone who never got the credit they earned, or someone who earned it in a room where nobody thought to look, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.